Hi everyone, and welcome to our second Parlour Lab with Michaela Prescott and Heather Shearer. Normally I'd be joining you from the University of Queensland campus in Meanjin, Brisbane, from the traditional lands of the Turrbal and Yuggera people, but today I'm very lucky staying at a friend's place and speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Minjinbal people in the Bundjalung Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to all First Nations elders, past, present and emerging, including those in the audience today. Thank you everyone so much for being here. We're so thrilled to have Heather and Michaela with us today to talk both locally and globally about their interdisciplinary action research projects. As it's the end of a really difficult year and we may not have the ability to go very far out of our much needed holidays, we wanted to invite Michaela and Heather to take us to faraway locations of Indonesia, Fiji and the Gold Coast. Parlour Lab is all about research speaking to practice, so we also wanted to speak today about projects that work between the two. And both Heather and Michaela have been working on large interdisciplinary action research projects, and we're so excited to hear more about how those projects work together and how everyone's competing interests and needs are met. I think it's really interesting that both projects work with governments to be mutually beneficial to residents in the hope of creating better quality cities. We're really excited to hear more about their projects today. So thanks everyone so much for joining us. Before we introduce Michaela and Heather, I'm just going to hand over to Macarena to go through some housekeeping for today's session.
Thank you, Kali. And hi, I'm Macarena de la Vega. And normally I will be joining you from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. But today I am the one speaking to you from Meanjin, Brisbane at the UQ campus. So very excited, though bummed that Kali and I can at least say hi to you from just one screen. Maybe next time.
Next time.
Anyway, I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne and still serve, but hopefully not for too long, as communications officer of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, SAHANS, one of the collaborators in this series. So before Kali introduces our first speaker, just a quick reminder of some Zoom etiquette. As always, please make sure your microphone is on mute unless you are speaking. Please leave your camera on if you can. It is very nice to be able to see your faces and feel a sense of being together in this space to speak. However, it soon gets glitchy. We will ask everybody to turn off your cameras, hoping that this will fix it. There will be an opportunity to ask questions for our speakers. So if you have one, please put it into the chat. We will then choose questions and invite you to ask them live to our speakers if you can. If you're not able to do it, just let us know in the chat and we can ask it on your behalf. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but they do help inform future events and plans. Over to you, Kali.
So hi everyone, for those I haven't met before, I'm Kali Marnain. I'm a practicing architect and I recently submitted about 2 or 3 weeks ago my PhD on the architecture of informal settlements in India, which makes me so excited to introduce our first speaker, Michaela, today. Dr. Michaela Prescott is a landscape architect with experience in both professional and academic contexts in Australia, Singapore and the Netherlands. She's a research fellow in the Informal Cities Lab at Monash University. Her practice-based research relates to the urbanism of water and river systems, the impact of infrastructure on neighbourhoods and communities, and delivery and sustainability of community-based projects. Michaela's doctorate, ongoing research, design studios and publications primarily focus on the socio-cultural dimensions of landscapes and living environments, and the evolving relationship of landscape, infrastructure and urbanism. She teaches at Monash and RMIT universities and has been a lecturer at RMIT and an invited design critic and guest lecturer at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH Zurich, the University Technology of Sydney, and the National University of Singapore Landscape Architecture programs. Thank you so much for being here, Michaela, and welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I guess I'll get straight into it. So I'll just share my screen and change into presentation mode. So I'm speaking to you today about the work that I've been involved in the RISE program. I've been working at Monash University as part of a team, a very big team, for the past 3 years now. And we're undertaking what we call water sensitive settlement upgrading. As Carly mentioned, I do have a background across both practice and research, and my doctoral research was actually based on fieldwork in Jakarta, Indonesia. So through the RISE project, my work with RISE, I've actually been returning to similar kinds of contexts to which I've worked in the past. So one of the things that RISE is specifically focused on is the challenges in developing countries around lack of access to management of drinking water services, sanitation and wastewater. And you can see at the top of this screen some images that are describing, I guess, the kinds of conditions that we're working with. The RISE program is focused on these challenges that I've mentioned. Through its action research, it's trying to develop evidence for a particular kind of solution to these challenges. So a water sensitive upgrade as one kind of pathway that addresses the whole of the urban environment. As I mentioned, it's a big project. You can see on this slide just a number of the organisations and institutions that are involved in collaborating on this work. And these groups are I guess mixed in their range of involvement. Some are involved in the more research focused arms of the project and others are involved in the implementation side. So when we talk about action research and RISE, what it's really focused on is a particular way of thinking and doing relating to the transformation of the built environment. And when I talk about the built environment, again, we're thinking about how do we improve informal settlement contexts through addressing their challenges. So this work is specifically focused on Indonesia, Makassar, and Suva in Fiji, and we've got 13 neighbourhoods in each country that we're working with over a period of 5 or so years. This included 2 demonstration sites. So the action research in the intervention, when we say the intervention, that's the water sensitive upgrade that we're developing, is around what are we trying to implement? How do we understand the contexts and communities that we're working with? How does that influence the implementation of this program and the research around that? It is requiring quite a bit of interdisciplinary collaboration. And that's not only within the RISE project and teams itself, but also with a range of different government, local authorities, communities, and international aid funders that are involved in the project. And we're collaborating to deliver this water sensitive cities approach to treating and improving sanitation and hygiene within these communities. So it's built off what's generally described as a green infrastructure approach, which is looking at using nature-based systems. In this case, we have particular systems that are treating household grey water, so grey water being water from kitchens, and black water being water from toilets and bathrooms through these wetland systems. And to implement this kind of intervention, it's really something that requires both social and technical aspects coming together. And this is in order to address both what is the intervention, how is it used and operated, who is it used and operated by, as well as that interaction or use on the very personal sort of scale. So what we've found is that in order to be able to work with these communities and stakeholders, we really need to bring together a whole lot of different expertise. And this stretches across public health, landscape architecture, engineering, ecology, in order to be able to implement this kind of socio-technical system with each community, their social, cultural and physical context. So the kind of complexities that we're talking about here are things like local practices, not only around hygiene, but also around decision-making, acting and doing, the kinds of contaminations in sites as well. So by engaging with our communities to identify potential exposure pathways, infrastructure locations, in order to really make it a site-specific intervention. But this is also, like I said, involving these other kind of stakeholders like local government, ministries and authorities, in order to make sure that we've got the right kinds of, I guess, systems set up to be able to operate and manage these infrastructures beyond the project's lifespan. So I've just included here some images that are showing the range of ways that we've been engaging with communities. These images are from our work with communities in Indonesia, but we have now completed or almost completed co-design for 6 communities in both countries. So you can see that we've been involving communities not only in sort of spatial discussions around where things might go and how communities are currently using their environments, but also around what are the potential current conditions of their, for example, water quality in this image. How is it currently, and what are the potential risk factors that might come about if we're not able to improve it through these kinds of interventions. And so this involved a range of science days, planning days that we've been running, and these activities have been contextualised for the different kinds of communities and stakeholders that we're working with in each country. So I should, I guess, take the opportunity now to mention that we do have, while we have a research team that's mostly based in Australia, we have local in-country teams that are very much focused on the work with the communities around the design and implementation of the program. And this kind of work that we're doing together really has been a matter of discussions that happen on a daily or weekly basis. So prior to this year, our team from Melbourne was also spending a lot of time in country. Of course, that's changed with the pandemic, but activities are still ongoing. And you can see that in the last couple of images, this is our demonstration site, which was recently commissioned. So this is one of our staff members in Indonesia who's been doing some sampling to check how these natural processes are working to make sure that everything's going okay. So yeah, I guess I'll just reiterate that there's a lot of people that are involved in this project beyond myself. So this is just a snapshot of the people that are directly involved in what we call the intervention, which is the delivery of this water sensitive upgrade. But there's also across RISE, I guess, a couple of hundred people directly involved in teams, as well as all of our other stakeholders. So I hope to talk a little bit more about that through questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michaela. That was really, really great. I would like now to introduce Dr. Heather Scherer. I hope I should have asked you about the pronunciation, Heather. I'm so sorry. Who is a research fellow with the Cities Research Institute at Griffith University in Queensland. She's a generalist spatial geographer and researches a number of subjects, including the tiny house movement, walkability, the mental health benefits of recreational walking, value uplift of transport and green infrastructure, and household water demand. Heather's PhD investigated household response to water demand policy, and she also holds a master's in environmental management and BA honors in environmental science. She is a member of the Planning Institute of Australia. Heather has extensive experience in industry, having worked for state government in Queensland and New South Wales in planning, spatial information, community engagement, wetlands and acids of soils, and water policy, communication. Heather has also worked for NGOs, including Wetland Care Australia and the Wildlife and Environment Society in Cape Town. We have also read that Heather has a Master of Wine from the Cape Wine Academy in South Africa, and would love to hear more about that. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put my tongue, I actually don't drink, but I'm going to share my screen. And
Thank you.
Mine is probably more sort of generally sort of a range of different things we do, and it's a lot more prosaic talking about the Gold Coast than it is about Indonesia. But anyway, we'll keep going. Can you see my screen fine? Okay, so we have a variety of, I'll just quickly go on to the next one. And quickly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects, and I won't go into because we have spoken about it. But in particular, I'm talking here from Tamborine Mountains, so which is primarily from the Yugara people and Yugambeh people. Please excuse me if I am not quite correct in my attribution, but anyway, I'd like to pay my respects. Tamborine Mountain is known as a sacred birthing place, and it's a very beautiful town, as you can probably see from behind me. I won't go into it. I only got into academia when I was 50, and as Macarena said, I've worked in a lot of different things. And I currently do research and lecturing, and I combine my teaching and research. One of the things I do in particular is teach something called practicum, where we have planning students who've got to go into industry, primarily council, specifically Gold Coast Council is quite a big one, also Brisbane City. And well, quickly, I won't talk too long because I've got my timer on. So my research aspect is part funded by the City of Gold Coast. And the Gold Coast City funds research projects via the city's research institute, including urban growth modelling, light rail pedestrian survey, a new project we're just working on called the Centres Project, and others. Our research is pragmatic, multidisciplinary, and focused on real life problems and real life solutions. And we combine academic expertise, student resources, and council expertise and data, because I love data. And of course, we work with the community as well. So two of the things I'll talk about in particular is the pedestrian survey. The pedestrian survey, it's got a longer, more complicated name, but everyone calls it the pedestrian survey. And it's part of a larger project, and it's been going for 7 years, and I've been running it for 5 years. And we get students who survey 2 days a year. They survey active transport users along the Gold Coast Council light rail line. And we count pedestrians, cyclists, strollers, mall traffic, etc. We normally have it in May or early June, but this year we did it in October. And it was quite interesting because we weren't going to do it this year because of the pandemic, but we decided to do it to Gold Coast City Council and the CRI. We decided to do it to get some really good during pandemic data. And it was really interesting because a lot of areas had pretty similar pedestrian numbers to previous years, but some areas were quite significantly less people, such as Surfers Paradise, and some had significantly more people, such as Burleigh Heads. And we think that the Surfer Paradise, we haven't written it up or done any analysis yet, we only did it a month or so ago, but likely the surfers' reduction in active transport is more likely to do with, we think the impact of the pandemic on international tourism, and the Burleigh Heads is likely due to the impact of the pandemic positively on domestic and local tourism. And we've done research on the light rail project. This was a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. Barbara Yen, who's an engineer, she's now in Taiwan. Corinne Mully from University of Sydney, and myself. And we did it on investigating the increase in the value of properties at various distances from the light rail, mostly doing hedonic modelling, and had some quite interesting findings from that. In fact, that properties really close to the light rail had a reduction in value, whereas ones within 100 to 400 metres and up to 800 metres had quite significant increases over the period of time. And it was a longitudinal process. We looked at property prices and other variables from 1996. I'm not going to go too much detail. The Centres Project is a new project, and we're inventing the Centres hierarchy. It's a planning scheme hierarchy, and it includes places that people know, the Gold Coast, the big shopping malls, but it also includes places like Surfers Paradise, Broadbeach, Burleigh, Southport, etc. We're looking to see if the current categorisation is justified and should it be revised. And this is a very interdisciplinary thing. It's the city's research institute, well, mostly Paul Burton and I, and a PhD student who's looking at active transport on the Gold Coast. And the students are going out doing qualitative analysis of the different centres. There's also different data that's coming into it, such as mobile phone data. And that's just an example of one of the centres. So as you can see, it's pretty much shopping malls. But it's really interesting to see. And I think I am 3 seconds out of 5 minutes. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic,
From the previous project, but
Thank you
yes.
so much.
Thank you.
You stuck so well to the time frame. Thank you.
I was timing myself.
I was wondering for my first question, both Heather and Michaela, you're dealing with huge teams and multiple funding sources. I was wondering how the funding works for your process for your projects, and how you ensure that all of the different needs from various stakeholders, including kind of the beneficiaries, like the members of the city, are being met through that, and whether the funding has an impact on that. Maybe I'll go to Heather first and then Michaela second.
Probably, because mine is more managed, as part of a large institution. It's probably not really managed by someone at my level, which is quite low. But yeah, my half of my role is actually funded by the City of Gold Coast. So I do projects such as that for the CRI. So we get the academic rigor and that sort of type of stuff, and which then sort of value adds obviously to the Gold Coast project. And of course we also have the double whatever benefit of it is that students, we get students student teaching and learnings as well. So the students, quite often of them, have actually gone on to work full-time for and permanently for the various city councils because of the experience in various projects. But I'm not juggling huge amounts of so I think Michaela's probably better to answer that one than me.
Well, I have to say I'm also not involved in day-to-day money management, which I'm very glad about, because it's like you said, it's a very big project that includes quite a number of staff across different geographies, as well as the infrastructure works itself. So with our project, we have a number of different sources of funding. The main research funding came from a UK-based charitable organisation called the Wellcome Trust. And so this is was finances that was very critical for setting up the project from the outset, making sure that we had adequate staffing in the range of different research institutions that are involved, but also within local research institutions in Indonesia and Fiji. There's a lot of small pots of partnered funding that are coming from each of those research institutions, so in-kind kind of contributions. As I mentioned, so the funding is broken down into research and implementation. In terms of the implementation funding, the 2 demonstration sites were funded by the Asian Development Bank, which is an infrastructure a loaning organisation. But then the work in the sites themselves, the finances has ended up coming from a couple of different sources. So the Indonesian implementation is funded by the Asian Development Bank as well, whereas the Fiji implementation is financed by the New Zealand Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I guess one of the challenges for the project as a whole has been managing the different requirements for reporting and spending of all of that money along the way of delivery. And so this has a range of different documentation requirements. We have social safeguards and environmental safeguards requirements from an implementation perspective, so making sure that we do no harm. And this is implemented in slightly different ways depending on the funder and the country context. But luckily I don't have too much to do with it, apart from being responsible for writing reports and managing, I guess, day-to-day impacts of how that impacts our work with communities and delivery, I guess.
Great. I mean, since we are talking stakeholders, I found really interesting in your presentation, Heather, how you talk about the project bridging teaching practice, students, and industry, not only through the practicum, but also involving students, for example, in the surveys. So I was wondering if there is any connection between students at Monash and the RISE project. That would be for Michaela. And if Heather can then talk a little bit more about this connection between the projects, her own, and also how these projects can liaise students with industry. Thank you.
So the students, because I teach, so as I mentioned, I have a complicated job. It's part funded by Gold Coast and it's also part funded as a lecturer. And practicum, I might just briefly explain, they have to have an industry placement of 30 days or 207, I think, hours as part of their planning degree, and they do that in their 4th year. So for the practicum, the Centres project, the students who are doing the Centres project are actually practicum students, so they're 4th year and honours students. And they particularly so these students have got to go out, they've got to go and like sometimes interview in people, places like that. The light rail project, we actually use any student who wants to do it, and it's paid. It used to be part of the degree, but so they do 4-hour stints. And what we do is generally the 2nd year after a student has done it, we open up, well, I tend to pick and choose them, but we say, would you like to be a supervisor? And we have 2 student supervisors who run the project, and it's quite big. Sometimes there's 50 or 60 students who've got to be managed, and it's 3-4 hour sessions for 12 hours a day. So it's quite logistically difficult over, how many different 12 sites each one? Oh, anyway, it's quite a lot. Maybe it's 16. So yes, they work very well with industry, and because they tend to be planning students and they're undergraduates, they're not going on normally to do higher education, they're looking for work. So it gives them fantastic work experience, and they use it to great benefit because the better ones tend to, well, the more proactive ones, should I say, not the better ones, quite often then get employed by the specific local government. So they get that industry experience that the students really appreciate. And the industry really appreciates too. So I hope I answered that okay.
Yeah, so I guess I'll try and answer in terms of RISE now as well. So because one of the challenges with RISE, I think, and in part because it is by nature an action research project, is that the project has a life of its own. And so when we're trying to engage students across any of the institutions, we have to help them develop a way of being engaged that is not going to be interrupted too much by the project's, I guess, timeline, which we at times have little control over. I have to say, because it's something that's operating in the real world. But that said, we have had students involved in a range of different ways. So in our team itself, we have 4 PhD candidates who have been involved in the project since 2017. They're now coming towards the end of their candidature, and for them the project has unfolded in quite a different way than they might have thought it would have originally, and so their projects have also evolved alongside the RISE project. So there've been PhDs and honours candidates involved in both our own faculty, but also in other faculties that are working in the project. So, for example, biological sciences. But then we've also been looking more recently at ways to involve students who are in bachelor and master's degrees. So we've run a couple of parallel design studios. Last semester we ran one that was a joint studio between RMIT University Department of Landscape Architecture as well as Monash University Department of Architecture. And for us at Monash, not having a landscape architecture program, but the project being very much a project that deals with urban environments, it was really beneficial to be able to work cross-institutionally to be able to enable that to happen. We've also had students in countries, so in Fiji and Indonesia, involved from local institutions, and that's more been centred around engagement with communities and supporting our local teams when we've been doing activities that have required, I guess, significant time in community. And that's often been around things like site surveys, household surveys and interviews and the like.
That's so fantastic to hear that students are such important members of the project. And I think I know a lot of students that would love the opportunity to be involved in something like that, particularly as an alternative way of getting work experience too. As you mentioned, Heather, it's fantastic, especially during the ups and downs of pandemic and difficulty finding internships and stuff like that. We have a question from the audience from Irene Kamau. If you could turn your computer on and unmute yourself, about prototypes, which I think is an interesting kind of lead in from students actually being on the ground and working and getting experience. Irene, if you could pose your question.
Hi, I wonder, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. My question was just about how transferable that project. I saw a little sketch that showed the collection of water and turning into grey water and wetlands, and just wondering how it works in an informal city, such as those in Africa, which are really, really dense. Would it be a transferable thing to have that kind of I guess I'm calling it a prototype for that? That was my question.
So that's coming to me then. Thanks, Irene. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's been one of the things that's, I guess, part of the research that we as a team are doing as we're implementing it. So it's the part of the action, I guess.
Yeah.
Along the way. So one of the things that we, I guess, can acknowledge about wetland systems and green infrastructure systems is they often take up a lot of space, and so it's been really interesting, I have to say, working on a project that's working in two different geographies at the same time to implement a similar kind of system and look at the challenges around that. So the communities in Indonesia that we're working with are comparatively quite dense, and there's very little land, and most land is privately owned. And so that means that when we're designing the systems with communities and our government stakeholders, that we're looking for the most compact ways in which we can implement them. So in the final slides and photographs that I shared, you could see that the wetlands were only 60 centimetres wide, and they were running alongside a roadway which was the only public land that we had within that neighbourhood. And it was something that was implemented with some community donation. So households in that particular site donated 50 centimetres of land to be able to have both the roadway as well as the green infrastructure water treatment system. And so we're looking at these kinds of collaborative, I guess, modes of delivery where you might have, I guess, different partners in a project contributing in different ways. In Fiji, in comparison, most land is it's not privately owned, so it's managed under community leases, and the houses are much. There's usually a lot more open land, although that land is used for agricultural activities and domestic gardening and these kinds of things. So I think through being able to work in those two places at the same time, we're able to see, well, how do we adapt it and make it so that it's something that we might be able to talk about implementing in other places following the RISE project's completion.
And Heather, is there any part of the projects that you're looking at that is kind of trying to transfer these interventions or learnings from these interventions in other places?
Not to my knowledge, but I work on specific small projects, and the City of Gold Coast and Griffith University works across a number of faculties and a number of fields. So The ones I'm doing, they're probably, I suppose, more relevant to, I don't like to use the word develop, but you know what I mean, sort of Australian cities, coastal Australian cities. There's other ones with part of the Sea Cities Initiative, which is also part of that, looking at sort of urbanized areas that are vulnerable to potential, you know, to future climate change and stuff like that, and they work with the architecture and urban design faculties. So because I have my specific ones I work at, so other than general, I suppose, sort of learnings for, I suppose, pedagogy, which I can pronounce probably, and working with students with industry and stuff like that, which is, I suppose, transferable across the board. Possibly some of the other projects that the Gold Coast does might be more relevant to other places in the world, but it's definitely relevant to coastal cities in Australia, of course, and fast growing urban areas. And the Gold Coast, the centres one in particular, I suppose, is quite really important, which is probably more relevant to Sunshine Coast than anywhere else, but it doesn't have a specific CBD. It's not it's not a circular city, you know, I don't want to sort of go into geographical theory, but it's, you know, it's a linear city. So one of the things they're looking at is, you know, the CBD is supposedly Southport, but it's not really, you know, where is in a dispersed city. And with the light rail, for example, there's been a lot of community opposition from planning perspective with the extension of the light rail to places like Palm Beach, because they see it's some sort of justification for putting high rises along the transport corridor, which is incorrect. And if you look back into the past when they built the existing light rail line, everyone said the same thing. Oh, it's just going to be this enormous sort of like high rises as far as the eye can see along the light rail, which hasn't come to pass, of course. And now everyone loves the light rail. But where it hasn't been built yet, they're complaining. So I suppose in terms of actual development and planning, it has good lessons for other places that might be considering putting in stuff like light rails, for example. So from a planning perspective, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Heather. Lillian had a question for Michaela as well, but maybe it can also be applied to the case of Heather's project. Lillian, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, hi. My question is probably a little bit loaded. I'm from Indonesia as well, so I'm interested to know from your point of view of just the main challenges across the cultural barrier to implement the project. I'm just very impressed with the model of this need-based intervention, because from Indonesia, I know that sanitation and water is a big issue there. You can't just get clean drinking water even in a big city. So with such a clever combination to have that intervention to improve the environment, and then you can gain the research out of the action, which, yeah, I'm blown away with how it all works. And I have actually lots of questions, but yeah, that's probably the first I want to ask Michaela.
Thanks, Lillian. So just checking, you're interested in the main challenges relating to implementation? Is that what where
Yes,
you're
yes,
headed?
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
just across the cultural barriers, yeah.
Well, so I guess what I would sort of start with is again reiterating that we're a project that's we have a local team based in South Sulawesi and Makassar. So our team is sitting under the Universitas Hasanuddin, one of the local universities, and so they're housed within the local university and staffed across a range of different disciplines. And so this includes both what we would call assessment team members that are coming from more sciences and public health backgrounds, as well as our implementation or build team, which is generally coming from planning and engineering fields. And this is, of course, relating to the way in which we're working within the community. And so these in-country teams have really been very important, I guess, bridge between trying to translate this technical system that really comes from, I guess, being developed in an Australian context. The water sensitive cities approach is something that was originally developed in Australia and then has since been applied within other areas of Asia. So more recently, for example, Singapore and China. But it has not been implemented in the way that it has been in Indonesia so far. So some of the challenges I think that we've been having, and I guess they're part of the process. They're around working with our local stakeholders in local government and in order to work out, well, how do we implement this as a starting point, and then working with both those partners and the communities to work out, well, how do we adapt it so that it's contextualized to the daily practices of the communities. And I guess along the way with that comes some kind of aspects of capacity building and education around, well, what would be the technical issues if the systems weren't used correctly, or something was flushed down a toilet that shouldn't be flushed down a toilet. These kinds of, I guess really, they end up being very much about the day-to-day practice of using your bathroom or using your kitchen, but it's something that we've had to be very, I guess, aware of. And so working with our local government stakeholders, understanding what are some of the challenges that they may have had in implementing other kinds of projects in the past, because there's a very strong history of settlement improvement and hygiene improvement projects within neighbourhoods that we're very, very aware of, and there's lots of successes from the implementation of those projects that we can learn from in the way that we adapt this particular RISE system.
This was just reminding me Kali's intervention in the salon as well a few months back, and we've been talking about cultural awareness in parlors events this year a lot as well. You know, both in practice with students, and I wonder, Heather, this may be a little bit of a, you know, we understand that it's not the same. You know, when we're talking about Indonesia and Fiji than when we're talking about the Gold Coast, but it is also a pretty multicultural place. There are a lot of backpackers. I know there are at least a lot of Spaniards. And you know, there are also cultural issues when we're talking about the use of transport and making sure, you know, wanting to improve or the view that people have about active transport or public transport. And I wonder if this has been also part of what your project was looking at.
The light rail specifically, what we do is it's at a distance. So the students really just take notes of how many people are walking and cycling and whatever. So specifically, but part of the whole broader project, which the Gold Coast runs and other parts of Griffith run, they do of course look at the multicultural aspect. And the city of Gold Coast is, as you mentioned, a very multicultural place, particularly certain parts of the Gold Coast. And the council itself does an enormous amount of ways in different ways. I was just remarking on it yesterday, how many ways that this is slightly sort of aside, how many ways they incorporate community into the things that they do, and how much free stuff they provide, because City of Gold Coast provides a huge amount of free stuff. But I was just thinking too, when Michaela was talking and the questions were asked, is that working with the community, and I've put with the community in capitals and with, which includes students and council staff and university staff, even though I actually live in Scenic Rim. And if you work with the community and not as top-down experts, and that is the way. And from my work back, goodness only knows, in the 1980s, working in wetlands on the Cape Flats in Cape Town to the far west of New South Wales, to acid sulfate soils, working with sugarcane farmers. If you come down as a top-down expert saying, we know what's good for you, no matter who they are, whether it's someone who lives in Labrador or whether it's someone who lives in Khayelitsha in Cape Town or a Buronga in New South Wales, and you come down from the government or the university and you say you're an expert, you're instantly going to put everyone's back up. So it's the same principles, whether it's the Gold Coast or whether it's anywhere. You know, you work with the community and you respect the community because they know a lot more about their community than you do, no matter how many degrees you have. So, I mean, it's just a general observation I always find.
And Lillian had a second part of her question about the similarities in challenges with implementing the project in Indonesia and Fiji. And I wonder that might tie in to that conversation that you were just having, Heather. I don't know, Lillian, if you wanted to add to that at all. Oh, you're just on mute. There we go.
I think you captured it well, Kelly. That's my second part of my question.
Yes, I'm just trying to think where I left off. So similarities between Indonesia and Fiji in terms of implementation and social or cultural aspects. I guess I would start with acknowledging that the physical and cultural aspects of both countries are very different, and it starts even on the level of, you know, the settlement organisation, you know, sort of tying into the discussion with Irene earlier about spatial aspects, but it also comes down to things like community organisation, community leadership structures, the level of engagement that local governments currently have with communities in terms of provision of services and these kinds of things. So one of the key differences between our Indonesian and Fijian communities, for example, is that our Fijian communities all have access to a piped water supply already. And for them, the water supply issue that you touched on, Lillian, isn't as critical. And when we talk about things like reuse of water and recycling of water, that's potentially not the highest priority, though it might be seen as a benefit that the system can have. For example, being able to use the water that's being treated and filtered by the system for watering crops or for supplementing household water supply in bathrooms. So whereas if we're talking with our Indonesian communities, being able to provide an alternate water supply is a really a strong motivator for being involved in the program potentially. So there are these kinds of aspects that have really been part of how we've rethought or how we've shaped the way that we engage and talk with communities about the project and its benefits, and adapted particular aspects of the infrastructure along the way.
That's awesome. Thanks, Michaela. So we've kind of been talking about like how the social, cultural and technical sort of combine. I was wondering if I could add a layer to that discussion in thinking about the future and the fact that we're living in this climate crisis, and the three sites we're talking about, the Gold Coast, Indonesia, Fiji, all need to deal with flooding. And I was wondering how that future aspect and flooding and climate crisis plays into your research. Maybe Heather, I'll hand to you first.
I do, and this is sort of slightly digressing because it's more of my personal interest in research, but during the bushfires, I did a spatial analysis of flooding and bushfire risk to the Gold Coast, because one thing, of course, working with a city like the Gold Coast, they're quite a wealthy municipality, so they've got lots of money, and they've got really good data. So I did a mapping exercise of the city of Gold Coast to see how many areas, how much residential property, because a lot of my interest is in housing, were in bushfire zones according to the CSIRO mapping, and how much of it were in flooding zones. So in terms of flooding, obviously over the period of, I found slightly surprisingly, to be honest, that the Gold Coast didn't have very many residential properties, at least, or even infrastructure that was particularly, well, that was in the designated flood areas, or the 1 in 100,000 flood thing. So obviously they've had that acknowledgement over time for planning, whereas if you map the Sunshine Coast, for example, in Queensland, you don't find the same thing. And Brisbane, as everyone knows, because it floods. Whereas bushfire, yeah, no comment. So the very high, fast-growing northwestern suburbs, such as Upper Coomera, Pimpama, those sort of areas, they had a lot of areas that was definitely in the bushfire buffer zone. But that's probably not related. So in terms of futures, I think one of the big futures, of course, in Gold Coast is very vulnerable. And, you know, the whole project is called Gold Coast Futures Project because they want to look at futures. And, you know, you're going to have more intense cyclones and you're going to have cyclones moving further south. So where I live during ex-cyclone Debbie, we had 500 millimeters of rain in under 29 hours, which is quite a lot of rain. But you know, this is rainforest, so it's sort of used to it. Whereas, you know, you did have flooding, the bridge washed away, and we had to detour via. It took another half an hour to get to work every day. But I think bushfires is a huge, because in January, February, well, actually more like November, December, we not used to bushfires here. It's like I live next to rainforest, and we're now being triggered as like very severe, highly severe fire danger, and you sort of don't expect that. And that's going to be a huge thing in the future. And I think that's something that, yeah, there's also, someone's mentioned Cape Town droughts, yes, and that's quite important too, because Cape Town is a place where you didn't really think, even though Cape Town has quite low annual rainfall, it's about, I mean, it's sort of average, about Sydney, it's about 600 or 700 mils a year. But no one expected Brisbane to have a drought either. That's what I did my PhD on, actually. Yeah, so sea level rise, Emily has said the projections for sea level rise of the Gold Coast, and then you've got the parts of the place which is built on the beach, and northern New South Wales is probably a better example, or northern beaches of Sydney, around Byron Bay, Belongil. You know, the people who live there are saying the council's got to build up the seawalls because our houses are washing away. But maybe they shouldn't have been built there in the first place. But so that adds a whole layer of complexity to you know, discussions about climate change. So to be honest, I actually don't think council, speaking about Gold Coast City Council, City of Gold Coast, they just renamed themselves. If it's not, so the planning scheme incorporates climate change projections, but I don't think it is incorporated to the extent that it should be. But that's just talking as an academic, and it's not really to do with the projects. But I think that's something that is, yeah, needs to be taken into account more in all of these research projects. And we're a bit oblivious to everything in Australia sometimes, even despite the fires and floods and everything else.
Yeah, that's great, Heather. And we can actually listen to your background, which is, you know, it's really lovely. We're coming to the end of the hour. And before we talk about key takeaways for practitioners in the audience, and rather than asking about COVID, because we've been talking about COVID all year, and since we're approaching a holiday season, Heather, tell us a little bit about that Masters of Wine. What is it?
It's a long. It wasn't raw. It was done in Cape Town, and my children's father, who is long ex, but never mind. He worked for a big hotel in Durban in South Africa, and his employers sent him on something called a certificate wine course, which he barely passed by copying from me, you know. And so I did really well. And then he must do the next one, which was the next layer up, which was, I can't remember. One was preliminary, one was certificate, and the next was diploma. And so then I did the certificate, and he did the certificate, and he failed it despite copying from me. I don't know how anyone could do that. And so then I thought, oh, this is quite fun. So I ended up doing a diploma of wine studies, which was really fascinating. We got to taste the most incredible wine. I mean, I haven't drunk alcohol for some time now, but it is just something. It was really interesting. It was fascinating because we didn't just study Australian and South African wine. We studied French, and we had to taste. And I was really good at the theory, but I wasn't that good at the practical. I barely passed it. A Spanish wine, of course.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
that's
clearing
good.
that up, Heather.
But given the fact I'm a vegan and I'm a teetotaler, I'm probably not the best person to ask about that.
Fantastic. Okay, so we're reaching the end of the hour, and our typical wrap-up question is, what is a key takeaway from your research for the practitioners in the audience, and perhaps from interdisciplinary collaboration? Maybe Michaela, I'll hand to you. And I don't know if you had any final thoughts about the previous question about futures and flooding and sea level rise, or just a key takeaway from your project for the practitioners.
Yeah, well, I could talk about the climate change aspects, but there's, I think, a lot to be said there, and maybe that's less around the interdisciplinary collaboration sort of framing of the session. I think from my perspective, when I was reflecting and preparing for today, or just thinking about what would I talk about, one of the things that really came through is the fact that the way that I engage in this as a research project is very much informed by my time in practice. So I have worked in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary practices before in the past. And the way that we're working in RISE is, particularly because of the urban aspects of our project, is still building off those same kinds of frameworks. But I think what's very clear is that interdisciplinary communication is incredibly challenging, but also incredibly important. And it's one of the things that, not to talk about COVID too much, but one of the things that's been really important this year is maintaining those open channels of communication between not only our interdisciplinary team members within Melbourne, but also our team members in each country. And so, we're still meeting with our in-country partners as frequently, if not more frequently, as normal. And I think finding ways to improve and build on communication is very important to focus on and not to be overlooked in its importance.
Thanks, Michaela. Heather, did you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Just quickly, I'd like to agree with Michaela. So I find that my own experience in projects such as this and the people you work with is informed by diverse experience, personal and otherwise, and history, like including in industry and government, and also other countries and places. So, and I like this because we've been talking about few entirely different places, but you can see learnings from all of them that inform the others. And that's, I suppose, one thing is that as to respect other knowledges from community, from other countries, because quite often, one might sit in a place like Brisbane or Meanjin or Gold Coast and say, oh, we know better, but people can and should learn from other people's experiences in other countries, other cultures, etc. We shouldn't be arrogant about our sort of rational, quite often specific culturally centric ways of thinking. And I know everyone knows this, but it's just something that's always useful to communicate the whole time and to learn, indeed, as if any of you are lecturers, from our students too. And I'm incredibly impressed by the young people. I mean, I'm quite old, like I'm pushing 60, but my students, I'm so impressed by how passionate and involved and caring and everything is just like, not when I was, a student for the first time in 1981, definitely not. I'm very impressed by, the future, and I continue to be optimistic despite climate change and everything.
Yeah, and learning is also a big part of what we do in this series, so that's also a good takeaway. Yeah. And just before we end, just remind everybody to please be in touch if you would like to get involved with this series. We're happy to welcome to the team anybody who would like to join us as a host, or anybody willing to share their research. So we do have a long list and we will go through it from next year. Thank you again to UQ Architecture and to Sahans for collaborating on the project, UQ for hosting, and also thanks to all partners who support all these online activities and events, and definitely Justine. Hope this wouldn't be happening without. Happy break, everybody. We would love to see you in the new year with more labs, more topics, and more researchers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.